My name is James Mitchell, though most folks just call me Jim. What I'm about to share with you isn't some campfire tale or a bad dream I woke up from. No, this happened to me back in October of 1957, and it's haunted me every day since. I've told myself 100 times to move on, to forget it ever happened. But how can you forget something like that? How can you forget when people you love are taken from you in a way so horrifying and impossible that no one would ever believe you? It started as a trip, a fresh start. I'd come home from the war a broken man, quiet and distant. I wasn't a great husband, and I sure wasn't winning any awards as a father. Margaret, my wife, and Tommy, our 12-year-old son, deserved better. A part of me thought maybe this trip to the Black Hills in South Dakota could make me better. Fix me. We just bought ourselves a shiny new Campra 1956 Airstream Overlander. A beauty, silver and sleek, with just enough room for the three of us and our dog Rex. It was Margaret's idea, really. She loved nature and thought some time away from the pressure of life, as she called it, could help us bond again. I thought she was just being optimistic. But I agreed. At least, I owed her and Tommy that much. We left on a bright and crisp October morning. Tommy was bouncing with excitement, leaning out the car window with Rex, the air ruffling their hair and fur. Margaret sat beside me, fiddling with her camera, one of those fancy models she'd saved up for. "Just think," she said, snapping a picture of Rex. "Fresh air. No phones, no work, just us." I forced a smile. I wasn't as excited as they were, but I kept that to myself. I focused on the road, trees and hills flying past like a blur. We reached the Black Hills that afternoon. Tommy was the first to spot the campsite, nestled in the woods, far from any town. The landscape was beautiful, but strange. The trees were tall and dense, the kind that blocked out most of the sky. And the air, it carried something. A stillness. A quiet that pressed in on you like a pair of hands around your chest. "Looks great," Margaret said brightly as she hopped out of the car, camera in hand, snapping pictures of the trees and hills. "Don't you think, Jim?" "Yeah," I said, clearing my throat, though something about the place set my nerves on edge. The warning? We'd barely started unpacking when an old man appeared near the edge of the trees. He seemed to come out of nowhere, his steps slow but deliberate. He was Native American, with long gray hair tied back and lines etched deep into his face. His clothes were simple, just a wool coat and boots. "Afternoon, folks," he called out, his voice strong despite his age. "Afternoon," I replied, though I caught the way Margaret tensed beside me. Tommy stared at the man curiously, while Rex began barking furiously at him, teeth bared. The man stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes calm but heavy, like he knew something we didn't. "I'm Running Bear," he said, hand on a carved wooden staff. "This place, it's sacred. You should leave." That caught me off guard. "Sacred?" I echoed. He nodded. "Burial grounds. Very old. My people have kept this land safe, but—" He glanced at Margaret, then at Tommy. "The hunger spirits are restless this year. It's not a good time to camp here." "Hunger spirits?" Tommy piped up, his curiosity outweighing his fear. "Tommy," I said, giving him a look, "don't be rude." But Running Bear didn't seem to mind. "The hunger spirits," he said, looking directly at Tommy, "were once people. But greed and desperation turned them into monsters. They are the shadow between man and beast. They are always hungry, always hunting for more." Margaret stepped closer to me. "That's just a legend though, right?" she asked, nervously laughing a little. "A story to keep people away?" Running Bear didn't laugh. He didn't even crack a smile. "Stories come from truth," he said simply. Then his eyes shifted to Rex, who was still growling. "Your dog knows. Animals always know." "Look, sir," I said, trying to keep my voice polite but firm. "This is a public campground, and we're just here for a few days. We'll be careful." Running Bear's face tightened, and for a moment, he looked at me like he pitied me. "Be careful of the hunger," was all he said before turning and walking back into the trees. disappearing as suddenly as he'd appeared. That first night, I couldn't relax. The fire crackled brightly in front of us, but the forest was still and dark, too dark. No owls, no crickets. Just the crack of wood in the flames and the occasional rustle of leaves. Margaret tried to make conversation with me, but I kept my answers short. I couldn't stop thinking about that old man, his warning, his eyes. It was ridiculous, right? Just a story. Tommy, on the other hand, seemed excited by it all. "Do you think the hunger spirits are real?" he asked, leaning forward, his face lit by the flickering firelight. "No," I said flatly. "Dad," he pressed, "what if they are?" "They're not," I snapped, harsher than I meant to. Margaret gave me a look and I sighed. "It's just a story, son. Now let's call it a night. Long day tomorrow." We put out the fire and headed into the airstream. I thought the night would be uneventful, but I was wrong. The first thing I noticed was the cold. Even with the heater running, the air was freezing. I pulled my blanket tighter, shivering. Then came the sounds. It started faint, like wind through the trees. But it wasn't wind. It was whistling. Slow and deliberate, almost like someone was standing outside, trying to get our attention. "Jim," Margaret whispered, her voice shaking. "Do you hear that?" I sat up, straining to listen. The whistling stopped. For a moment, it was dead silent. Then came scratching, low and steady, like nails dragging across the metal shell of the airstream. Rex went wild, barking and growling, clawing at the door. Margaret grabbed my arm, her knuckles white. "Stay here," I said, grabbing the flashlight. "Jim, don't you dare go out there," she hissed, her voice trembling. But I couldn't ignore it. I had to prove to myself and to her that it was nothing. Holding the flashlight tight, I opened the door. The cold hit me first, sharp and bitter, like stepping into a freezer. I scanned the woods, but there was nothing. No wind, no movement. Then I saw something. A shadow. White and tall, just at the edge of the trees, standing still as stone. For a second, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then it moved just a little, just enough. I slammed the door shut and locked it. Margaret's eyes were wide. What was it? "Nothing," I lied, sitting back down and gripping the flashlight until my knuckles hurt. But I knew what I saw. I just didn't know what it was. And that was only the beginning. The next morning, I tried to shake off the strange feeling from the night before. Margaret and Tommy were still asleep when I stepped outside with Rex. The air was sharp and cold, colder than it should have been for October. My breath came out in puffs as I looked around the campsite. Everything seemed normal quiet, still, even peaceful in a way. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Rex stayed close to my side, his ears pinned back, his body tense. Normally, he'd be racing through the trees, chasing squirrels or sniffing everything in sight, but not today. He just kept his head low, his tail tucked. I walked out a little farther, crunching through the frost-covered grass, and that's when I saw it. The claw marks. They were on the same trees Tommy had been poking around the day before, long and deep, like something big had raked its nails down the bark. I couldn't figure it out. A bear, maybe? But these weren't bear marks. They were different, too clean, too purposeful. "Tommy!" I called, my voice echoing through the woods. He came stumbling out of the airstream a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes. Margaret followed, carrying her camera. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice still groggy from sleep. "Take a look at this," I said, motioning for them to come over. Tommy's face lit up with curiosity when he saw the marks, like it was some kind of treasure map. Margaret, on the other hand, frowned, snapping a few pictures without saying a word. I could see the worry creeping into her face, but she stayed quiet. The morning passed slowly. Margaret busied herself taking photographs of the woods while Tommy explored the campground again. I stayed close to the airstream, chopping wood for the fire and keeping an eye on Rex. Margaret showed me one of her photos after lunch. "Look at this," she said, handing me the print. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Just trees, leaves, the soft morning light cutting through the branches. But then, in the corner, I noticed it a faint white blur. If you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it. But once you saw it, it stuck in your brain. "What do you think it is?" she asked, her voice low. "Could be anything," I said, shrugging it off. "A trick of the light. Maybe some fog." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. Tommy came running up a little while later, clutching something in his hands. "Dad, look what I found." I took the object from him. It was a bone, small and smooth, like it had been picked clean. At first, I thought it was from a deer or maybe a bird, but the shape didn't seem right. It was too long, too straight. "Where did you get this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Over there," he said, pointing toward the trees. "There's a whole bunch of them. They're all in a circle, like someone put them there on purpose." I felt my chest tighten. "Tommy, listen to me. You don't go back there, you hear me? You stay close to the campsite." "But Dad..." "Tommy," I said, cutting him off, "I'm serious. No more wandering off." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't understand why I was so worked up. Margaret glanced at me, her face full of questions, but I didn't have any answers to give her. That night, the cold came back with a vengeance, even worse than before. The heater in the airstream struggled to keep up, and we all huddled under blankets, trying to stay warm. "I don't get it," Margaret said, her breath fogging up the air. "The weather report didn't say anything about freezing temperatures." I didn't respond. I was too busy listening. The whistling was back, faint and slow, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. And this time, it wasn't alone. There were other sounds, branches snapping, footsteps crunching in the frost. "Do you hear that?" Margaret whispered. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely audible. Rex started growling again, his body pressed up against the door. Tommy sat up in bed, clutching his blanket. "Dad," he said, his voice shaking. "What is that?" "I don't know," I admitted. I grabbed the flashlight again, my hands trembling as I clicked it on. Margaret grabbed my arm. "Don't go out there," she said. "I just need to check," I told her, though every part of me wanted to stay inside. "I won't go far, I promise." She didn't say anything, but the fear in her eyes was enough to make me hesitate. "Stay here," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I stepped outside, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The cold hit me like a wall, biting into my skin. I took a few steps forward, my boots crunching on the frosty ground. The woods were too quiet. Even the whistling had stopped. And then I saw it. At first I thought it was a tree, tall and pale, standing perfectly still. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't a tree. It was a figure, thin and white, with arms too long and fingers that looked like claws. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It just stood there, watching me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A man? An animal? Something else? The figure tilted its head just slightly, as if it were curious. And then, without a sound, it stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. I didn't wait to see where it went. I turned and bolted back to the airstream, slamming the door shut behind me. Margaret and Tommy stared at me, their faces pale. "What was it?" Margaret asked. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just sat down, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. Whatever I'd seen out there, it wasn't human, and it wasn't done with us yet. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. The night had been too quiet after I came back inside, and Rex growled at the door until the early hours. But now, even he seemed restless and uneasy. Margaret was sitting at the little table in the airstream, flipping through her photos. Her face was tight, worried. I could hear Tommy humming softly to himself as he poked around outside, probably exploring again. "You okay?" I asked Margaret, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. She looked up at me, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Take a look," she said, sliding one of the photos across the table to me. I picked it up, my stomach sinking as I saw what she was pointing to. It was a picture she'd taken of the trees near our campsite, something I'd seen her shoot the day before. But there was more than just trees in the photo. Tucked in the shadows was a shape tall, thin, pale. Just like the thing I'd seen the night before. I put the picture down. "It's nothing," I said, though my voice sounded weak even to me. "Nothing?" she repeated, narrowing her eyes. "Jim, what did you see out there last night?" I didn't answer. I didn't know how to. Later that day, while Margaret stayed in the Airstream poring over her photos and trying to get warm, I decided to take a walk around the woods. I told myself I needed to clear my head, but deep down, I think I was looking for answers I wasn't ready to admit I needed. Rex came with me, sticking close to my side. We didn't go far, just far enough to feel like we were away from the campsite. And that's when I found it. At first, I thought it was just another pile of fallen branches, or a shadow cast by the trees. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't branches at all. It was a deer, or at least, it had been a deer. What was left of it was sprawled out on the ground in a way that made my skin crawl. Its body was torn open, its ribs sticking up like jagged twigs. But it wasn't just that. The thing that made my stomach turn was the way the carcass had been arranged. The bones, the blood, it was all in some sort of pattern. A shape, a star. "Jesus," I muttered, stepping back and tightening my grip on the flashlight I'd brought with me. Rex growled low in his throat, his ears pinned back. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand on end, that same creeping feeling that told me I wasn't alone. A branch snapped somewhere behind me, and I spun around, scanning the trees. "Who's there?" I called, though my voice cracked halfway through. No answer. But I thought I saw something just for a second move between the trees, too fast to catch. I didn't wait to see it again. I turned and headed back to the campsite, Rex practically glued to my leg the whole way. When I got back, Margaret met me at the door, clutching her camera like it was some kind of weapon. "Where's Tommy?" I asked, stepping inside and wiping the sweat from my brow. Her face paled. "I thought he was with you," she said. For a second, my heart stopped. Then I heard the sound of crunching leaves and turned to see Tommy coming out from the trees, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. "Where were you?" I demanded, marching toward him. "Just looking around," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. I grabbed his arm, but he yanked it away. "Hey!" he snapped, his tone sharper than I'd ever heard it. "Tommy," Margaret said softly, stepping between us. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he shouted. Then, just as quickly as his anger flared, it vanished. He stuffed his hands back in his pockets and looked down at the ground. "I'm fine, just tired or something." Margaret shot me a worried look, but I didn't know what to say. That evening, the wind picked up. It howled through the trees, rattling the Airstream as we huddled inside. The heater was barely keeping up, and I could see our breath as we talked. "I heard something about this area on the radio earlier," Margaret said, her voice low. "Something about rangers looking for a couple of missing hikers." "Missing hikers?" I repeated. She nodded. "They said the Black Hills can be dangerous this time of year. People wander off, can't find their way back." Her voice trailed off, and I could tell she didn't fully believe what she was saying. It wasn't until later that night, when we were all trying to fall asleep, that we heard it. The radio, which had been crackling faintly with static all day, suddenly came to life. "Repeat, we need assistance. Anyone out there?" It was a man's voice, breathless and urgent, cutting through the static like a knife. Margaret and I shot up at the same time, both of us staring at the small radio on the counter. "Can anyone hear me?" the voice continued. "We're at the east side of the burial grounds. Something's..." The transmission cut out, replaced by a high-pitched whine that made my ears ring. Then, just as quickly as it started, it went silent. "What the hell was that?" Margaret whispered, her face pale. I didn't answer. I didn't know. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat near the door of the Airstream with Rex at my feet, my flashlight clutched in one hand and the radio in the other. The woods were alive with sounds whistling, snapping branches, faint voices I couldn't quite make out. At one point, I thought I heard someone calling my name. It sounded like Margaret at first, but when I turned to look, she was sound asleep in bed. Then it sounded like Tommy, but when I checked, he was curled up under his blanket, breathing softly. Rex barked suddenly, his fur bristling as he stared at the door. My heart leapt into my throat as I stood up, holding the flashlight like a weapon. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer, just the sound of the wind and the trees groaning in the cold. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting for something to happen, but eventually the sound stopped. Rex stopped barking, and the silence returned. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning felt strange, quiet, too quiet. When I opened the door of the airstream, the cold hit me like an icy slap to the face. Frost covered everything, the grass, the trees, even the airstream itself. It didn't look like October anymore. It looked like the dead of winter. Margaret was sitting at the table again, this time with a cup of coffee in her hands. She wasn't drinking it, though. She was just staring at it, like she was lost in her own thoughts. "We need to leave," she said out of nowhere, her voice barely above a whisper. I paused, not sure I'd heard her right. "What are you talking about?" She looked up at me, her eyes red and tired. "Jim, something's wrong here. I can feel it. Something's watching us. This isn't just in my head. I know you feel it too." I didn't want to admit that I did, but the look in her eyes told me she already knew the truth. "We can't leave," I said finally, keeping my voice steady. "At least not yet. The airstream's covered in frost. Tires are frozen solid. It'll take some time to get it ready to move." Margaret didn't argue, but I could tell she wasn't happy about it. Tommy, meanwhile, was sitting in his usual spot by the window, drawing something in his notebook. I walked over to see what he was working on. "What you got there, sport?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't look up. "Just some stuff I saw," he murmured. I glanced down at the page and felt my stomach twist. He'd drawn the claw marks on the trees, the strange star pattern in the deer carcass, and something else, something tall, pale, and with long, twisted arms. "Where did you see this?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He shrugged. "Just around." "It's not a big deal, Dad." "It is a big deal," I snapped. "I told you to stay close to the campsite. You've been wandering off again, haven't you?" Tommy didn't answer. He just closed his notebook and walked away. It wasn't long after breakfast that we realized Rex was gone. "Where is he?" Margaret asked, her voice rising with panic. She was calling his name, pacing around the campsite. "He was here this morning," I said, though my chest was tightening with dread. I grabbed my coat and a flashlight and started searching the woods. "Rex," I called, my voice echoing through the trees. "Come on, boy." But there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of frost under my boots. And then I saw it. Rex's collar. It was lying on the ground, covered in blood. I stared at it for what felt like forever, my mind racing. I didn't want to believe it, but there was no denying what I was looking at. Something had gotten to him. I picked up the collar with a shaking hand and started back toward the campsite. When I got there, Margaret and Tommy were waiting for me. "Did you find him?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. I held up the collar, and her face crumpled. "Oh my God," she whispered, covering her mouth with her hands. Tommy didn't say anything. He just stared at the collar, his expression blank. I decided to search the woods again, this time for answers. I knew something wasn't right here, and I couldn't just sit around waiting for the next bad thing to happen. I told Margaret and Tommy to stay put and headed out with my flashlight. The cold was bone deep, making my fingers and toes ache as I walked. After about 20 minutes, I found something I hadn't seen before, a cave. It was hidden behind a cluster of trees and rocks, almost like it didn't want to be found. I hesitated for a moment, standing at the entrance before stepping inside. The air inside the cave was even colder than outside, my breath visible in white clouds. The walls were covered in ice, making it hard to walk without slipping. But what caught my attention were the carvings. They were etched into the stone walls, ancient and strange, with symbols I didn't recognize. There were pictures, two figures, that looked human but weren't. They were tall and thin, with long arms and sharp claws. My stomach churned as I realized one of the carvings showed a child transforming into one of those things, slowly, bit by bit, until they weren't a child anymore. I backed out of the cave, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew one thing. We were in serious trouble. By the time I got back to the campsite, Tommy was shivering under a heavy blanket. His face was pale, his cheeks flushed red with fever. "He won't stop shaking," Margaret said, her voice edged with panic. "I don't know what to do." I crouched beside him, placing a hand on his forehead. He was burning up, his skin so hot it was almost painful to touch. "What happened?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. He said he was cold. Margaret explained, "Even when I wrapped him up, and then he just collapsed." Tommy opened his eyes, but they didn't look like his eyes anymore. They were glassy, unfocused, like he was looking at something far away. "Dad," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm so hungry." Margaret looked at me, her face pale with fear. "What do we do, Jim?" I didn't have an answer. That night, the temperature dropped even further. It felt like we were sitting in the middle of a blizzard, though there wasn't any snow. Just the cold, cutting through the walls of the airstream like they weren't even there. I sat by the window, flashlight in hand, watching the woods. The trees were dark and still, but I could feel something out there. I knew it was watching us. Then I saw them. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving the branches, but as I looked closer, I realized they weren't branches. They were figures. Pale, thin, and tall, with limbs that moved too smoothly, too unnaturally. There were 3 of them, standing just beyond the edge of the campsite, their bodies blending into the frost-covered trees. They didn't move closer. They just stood there, watching, waiting. I felt my stomach drop as one of them slowly tilted its head, almost like it knew I was looking at it. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest, and grabbed Margaret's arm. "We can't stay here," I whispered. "We need to leave. Now." "What did you see?" she asked, her voice shaking. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Leaving wasn't an option anymore. The Airstream's tires were still frozen solid, like they'd been welded to the ground by ice. Even if we could break them free, the frost had completely covered the windows and the doorframe, sealing us in like we were trapped in a box. Tommy's fever was worse now. He was bundled under every blanket we had, but he still shook uncontrollably. His skin had gone paleo-palient. His lips were starting to crack. Every so often, he mumbled something under his breath, words I didn't recognize. Margaret sat next to him, stroking his hair and whispering soft words to calm him, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She kept glancing at me, silently begging me to do something, to fix this. But I didn't know how. It was a little after midnight when it happened. I was pacing near the door, flashlight still in my hand, trying to ignore the sounds outside, the whistling, the faint thuds, the scratching. Margaret had finally dozed off, her hand still resting on Tommy's arm. "Dad," Tommy whispered suddenly, his voice hoarse. I froze and turned to him. "I'm here, buddy," I said, kneeling beside him. "What is it?" He stared at me with wide, glassy eyes. "I'm so hungry, Dad. It hurts." I swallowed hard. "I know, son. We'll get you something to eat as soon as we can, okay? Just hang in there." But he shook his head. "It's not that kind of hungry." His voice sent a shiver down my spine. It didn't sound like him anymore, not entirely. It was deeper, rougher, like there was something else speaking through him. And then I saw his hands. His fingers were longer than they should have been, the joints swollen and twisted. His nails had thickened, darkened, curling like claws. "Margaret," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She stirred, blinking awake. "What is it?" "Look at his hands," I said, my stomach churning. She gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. "Oh my God!" Tommy's breathing quickened, his chest rising and falling like he couldn't get enough air. "It's so cold," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Why is it so cold?" I didn't know what to do. I felt completely helpless, trapped between wanting to comfort my son and wanting to run out of that camper and never look back. Then, all at once, he went still. "Tommy," Margaret whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Tommy, wake up." His eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I thought they were glowing just faintly, like the reflection of moonlight on water. "Get back," I said, pulling Margaret away. But Tommy didn't move. He just stared at us, his chest heaving. And then he smiled. It wasn't a child's smile. It was something else set-twisted. Wrong. "I hear them," he whispered, his voice almost sing-song. "They're calling me." Before either of us could respond, there was a loud crash outside. The airstream shook violently, like something had thrown its full weight against the side. Margaret screamed, grabbing onto Tommy as he flinched and curled into himself. I jumped to my feet, gripping the flashlight like it was some kind of weapon. Another crash, this time louder. The frost-covered windows began to crack, fine spiderwebs spreading across the glass. "They're out there," Tommy whispered, his voice oddly calm. "They're coming." I turned toward the door just as something slammed against it. The metal frame groaned under the weight, and for a second, I thought it might buckle. "Stay here," I said, though my voice was shaking. I grabbed an old hunting knife I'd brought along. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "Jim, don't," Margaret pleaded, her eyes wide with fear. "I'll be fine," I lied, stepping toward the door. The moment I opened it, the cold rushed in like a living thing. It bit into my skin, cutting through my clothes, and made my breath catch in my throat. And then I saw them. There were 3 of them, standing just at the edge of the campsite. They were tall, too tall, their bodies impossibly thin and pale, like they'd been stretched out. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and their mouths hung open, revealing rows of jagged teeth. One of them took a step forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. "Stay back!" I shouted, brandishing the knife. The thing stopped, tilting its head like it was studying me. Then it opened its mouth wider, and a sound came out, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was Margaret's voice. "Jim," it said, perfectly mimicking her tone, "help me." I froze, my mind racing. It wasn't her. It couldn't be. But hearing her voice come out of that thing's mouth, it was almost too much. The creature lunged at me. I swung the knife wildly, slicing through the air as it came closer. It was fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen, and before I knew it, I was on the ground, the thing looming over me. Its face was inches from mine, its breath icy and foul. For a moment, I thought I was done for. But then, it recoiled, hissing like a wild animal. I realized I was still holding the flashlight, and the beam had landed on its face. It stumbled backward, covering its eyes with one long clawed hand. Light. It didn't like the light. I scrambled to my feet and pointed the flashlight at the other 2 creatures, forcing them to back away. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. "Jim, get back in here!" Margaret screamed from inside the airstream. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. "What was it?" Margaret asked, clutching Tommy to her chest. "What did you see?" I didn't know how to answer. I just shook my head, trying to catch my breath. "It's not over," Tommy said suddenly, his voice cold and distant. We both turned to look at him. "They're still hungry," he whispered, his lips curling into that twisted smile again. And I knew he was right. I stood there, frozen, staring at Tommy. The glow in his eyes was gone now, but the way he smiled it wasn't right. It wasn't my boy's smile. Margaret started crying quietly, holding him close. "Jim?" she whispered. "What's happening to him?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what to say. Then came another crash. This time it was harder, loud enough to rattle the entire airstream. I turned toward the door, gripping the flashlight tighter. "They're coming," Tommy said in that cold, distant voice. "You can't stop them." I ignored him, shaking off the chill that crawled up my spine. "Margaret," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Take Tommy and get into the back. Now." "What about you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Just go," I said firmly. She hesitated but eventually nodded, guiding Tommy toward the small bedroom at the back of the airstream. I waited until I heard the door click shut before turning my attention back to the front. The frost on the windows was spreading fast now, thickening like it was alive. Another crash came, and this time the door buckled under the force. I didn't have much time. I didn't have a gun, but I had something else, something old I'd brought back from my days in the war. Tucked under one of the seats was a flamethrower, something I hadn't touched in years but had held on to for God knows what reason. My hands shook as I pulled it out, checking to see if it still worked. The fuel tank was half full. It would have to do. Another crash. The door dented inward, the metal screeching under the strain. I took a deep breath, strapping the flamethrower to my back and lighting the pilot flame. The faint, flickering glow gave me just enough light to see the shadows outside the window. They were moving, circling, closing in. I opened the door. The cold rushed in like a wave, stealing the breath from my lungs. I stepped outside. The flamethrower gripped tightly in my hands and aimed the nozzle at the nearest shadow. It was one of them, the tall, pale creatures, its glowing eyes locked on me. It let out a horrible screech, the kind of sound that makes your ears ring and your stomach turn. I pulled the trigger. Fire roared out, cutting through the icy air and lighting up the campsite. The creature recoiled, its skin blackening and cracking as it stumbled backward. The other two shrieked, their voices blending into an awful, bone-chilling howl. They didn't like fire. That much was clear. I advanced slowly, forcing them back toward the trees. One of them lunged at me, its claws swiping through the air, but I turned the flamethrower on it before it could get close. The flames caught it mid-stride, and it collapsed into a smoldering heap. But the third one, it was smarter. While I focused on the others, it circled around me, moving fast despite its awkward, jerky gait. Before I could react, it was on top of me. I hit the ground hard, the flamethrower slipping from my grasp. Its claws dug into my shoulder, pinning me down as its jagged teeth snapped inches from my face. For a moment, I thought it was over. I thought this was how it would end. But then the creature recoiled, hissing and clawing at its chest. I looked up and saw the flash of light Margaret's camera. "Get off him!" she screamed, snapping photo after photo. The bright flashes seemed to stun the creature, its movements slowing long enough for me to grab the flamethrower. I rolled onto my back, aimed it straight at the thing's chest, and fired. The flames engulfed it, and it let out a final, piercing scream before collapsing into a pile of ash and charred flesh. It wasn't over. "Tommy." I ran back to the airstream, Margaret close behind me. When we reached the bedroom, the door was ajar, swinging slightly in the icy breeze. "Tommy?" Margaret called, her voice breaking. He was standing near the window, his back to us. His shoulders were hunched, his arms hanging limply at his sides. "Tommy?" I said softly, stepping toward him. He turned slowly, and my heart sank. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and distant. His fingers had elongated even more, now fully claw-like, and his teeth sharp, jagged, wrong-glinted in the dim light. "I'm so hungry," he whispered, his voice echoing with something not human. "Tommy!" Margaret sobbed, reaching out for him. "Stay back!" I shouted, grabbing her arm. But Tommy, or whatever was inside him, now moved faster than I could react. He lunged at Margaret, his claws slicing through the air. I pulled her out of the way just in time, but the force sent both of us crashing to the floor. "Tommy!" I shouted, trying to reach him. But he wasn't listening. He was gone. I grabbed the flamethrower, my hands trembling as I aimed it at him. I couldn't do it. My boy was still in there. He had to be. "Dad," he said suddenly, his voice soft and trembling. For a moment, he looked like himself again, a scared, helpless kid. "Help me." I hesitated. And then he lunged again. This time, Margaret stepped in front of me. She held up the camera and snapped one last photo, the flash blinding him for just long enough. "Jim," she said, her voice full of tears. "Do it." I didn't have a choice. I pulled the trigger. The flames roared to life, swallowing him whole. For a brief moment, I thought I saw him smile, his real smile, as the fire consumed him. And then he was gone. The Wendigos didn't come back after that. They'd been driven off, at least for now. When the sun finally rose, the frost began to melt, and the Airstream's door cracked open. Margaret and I sat together on the ground, holding each other in silence, watching the forest slowly come back to life. We never found Tommy's body. All that was left was ash and the faint smell of smoke. To this day, I like to think he found peace in those flames, that he got to be my boy again for just one brief moment. We left the Black Hills that morning, and I swore I'd never go back. The stories I've told you spread around town, turning into legends and whispered warnings. Some people believe me, most don't. But every October, when the nights start getting cold, I hear the whistling again. And I know they're still out there, waiting, hungry. My name is David Walker, and what I'm about to share isn't some story you'd read in a book or hear around a campfire. It happened to me back in the summer of 1983, deep in the painted desert of Arizona. I can't forget those days, no matter how much I wish I could. At the time, I was a professor of anthropology, fascinated by Native American legends and folklore. I'd been studying the stories about skinwalker shape-shifting beings said to guard sacred ground. I thought it was just myth, a piece of rich cultural history. I had no idea what I was walking into. That August, my wife Linda, our photography expert, my bright young grad student Kevin, and an elderly Navajo guide named Joe Blackhawk joined me on what we thought would be a harmless research expedition into an old canyon. We packed up our beat-up 1981 GMC Palm Beach RV and headed for the desert, excited, curious, and completely unaware of the nightmare waiting for us. It all started small little things we barely noticed at first. But looking back, the signs were there, right from the beginning. The drive into the desert was peaceful, almost eerily so. Miles of red rocks and dusty roads stretched into the horizon, and the heat shimmered off the ground like waves. By the time we reached the canyon, the sun was already low on the horizon, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. Linda was snapping photos through the RV window, marveling at the beauty of it all. "This place is incredible," she said, her voice filled with awe. "It's like stepping into another world." Joe, though, wasn't nearly as enchanted. He'd been quiet the entire ride, staring out the window as if he could see something we couldn't. The second the RV came to a stop, he turned to me and said, "We don't stay here after dark. It's not safe." I laughed, thinking he was just being superstitious. "Come on, Joe, it's just a canyon. What's the worst that could happen?" But Joe's face didn't change. His eyes were serious, maybe even a little scared. "This isn't just a canyon. This is cursed land. It's better if we leave before the sun." Joe's warning echoed in my mind as we unpacked the RV, though I tried not to let it bother me. I told myself he was just being overly cautious, caught up in old legends. Linda was off taking photos of the canyon walls, and Kevin stayed busy setting up some of the equipment we'd brought. I stared out at the landscape, the jagged rocks, the endless stretch of desert hand for the first time. I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, just stillness. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. Joe didn't stay long. "I'll be back before sundown tomorrow," he said, standing by the RV door. "Do not wander too far, and whatever you do, don't touch anything that doesn't belong to you." "We'll be fine," I insisted, forcing a smile. But Joe didn't smile back. He just gave us one long look like he wanted to say something else and then walked off, disappearing into the desert. Later that afternoon, Kevin called out to me. His voice sounded excited, like he'd struck gold. "Dr. Walker, you need to see this." I followed his voice to a small shaded alcove at the canyon's edge. Inside was something that made my heart race not from fear, but from pure fascination. It was a piece of pottery, old and partially buried in the sand. Its surface was covered in strange markings, symbols I didn't recognize. "This has to be centuries old," I said, crouching down to examine it. "Careful with it, Kevin. Don't break it." Linda joined us, camera in hand. "What do you think it says?" she asked, snapping a photo of the clay shards. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "It could be warnings, instructions, maybe even a story. We'll need to study it." As we carefully uncovered more pieces, Linda noticed something etched into the canyon walls above Yusa's series of ancient paintings. They were crude, but their meaning was clear. They showed figures that looked human, but not quite. One had the head of a deer, another the body of a coyote. Beneath them were smaller figures, human ones, lying on the ground. "Shapeshifters," Linda said softly, lowering her camera. "That's what they are, right?" "Skinwalkers," I corrected. But saying the word made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Kevin scoffed. "Come on, guys, this is just art. Tribal stories keep kids out of trouble." "Maybe," I muttered. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. That night, after dinner, we sat around the small fire Kevin had built. The canyon looked different and the dark shadows stretched farther. The rocks seemed sharper and the air felt heavy. Linda was unusually quiet, staring at the photos she'd taken during the day. "David," she said suddenly, her voice low, "look at this." She handed me her camera. It was a picture of the cave paintings, but in the corner of the frame there was something else. A figure, faint and blurry. It was hard to make out, but it looked like someone or something standing in the shadows, wearing what looked like a deer skull. "That wasn't there when I took the picture," Linda whispered. "You probably just didn't notice," Kevin said, leaning over to look. "Or it's a trick of the light." But Linda shook her head. "Number, I'm telling you, I didn't see anything." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to believe Kevin was right, that it was just a coincidence, but something about it didn't sit right with me. We decided to get some rest, but sleep didn't come easily. The fire outside crackled softly, and the RV was surprisingly warm. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around midnight, I heard something. It wasn't loud, just faint, almost like music. A slow, haunting melody carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then Linda stirred beside me. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. "It's probably nothing. Go back to sleep." But it didn't stop. The strange, flute-like music echoed through the canyon, growing louder and then fading again, like it was circling us. And then the animals started leaving. Linda was the first to notice. "The birds," she said, pointing out the RV window, "they're all flying away." I looked outside and saw it too. Not just small animals, rabbits, even a lone coyote all scattering in the same direction, as if something was chasing them. Kevin woke up, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on?" "I don't know," I said honestly. Linda grabbed my arm, her eyes wide. "David, what if Joe was right? What if we shouldn't be here?" The next morning came, but the night left its mark on all of us. None of us had slept well. Linda looked pale. Kevin was unusually quiet, and I could feel a weight in the air that hadn't been there the day before. Maybe it was just my imagination, but the canyon itself seemed different. Breakfast was rushed and awkward. No one really talked about what we'd heard during the night, but it was clear we were all thinking about it. Linda swore someone had been walking around the RV just before dawn, but when we checked outside, there were no footprints. Kevin rolled his eyes and said it was probably just the wind. But even he didn't seem convinced. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became unbearable. We decided to take an early break and drink some water before continuing our work. But when Kevin opened the RV's cooler, he froze. Did someone mess with the water?" he asked, staring inside. "What do you mean?" I walked over to see what he was talking about, and my stomach dropped. The gallon jugs of water we'd brought weren't clear anymore. Instead, the liquid inside was murky, thick, and dark red. It looked like blood. Linda backed away. "What the hell?" "Maybe it's rust," Kevin said quickly, though his voice shook. "You know, contamination or something." He grabbed one of the jugs and unscrewed the cap, but as soon as he tilted it, the thick water oozed out, coating his hands. It wasn't rust. "Stop," I said, pulling it out of his grip. "Don't touch it. Just leave it." "Now what?" Linda asked, her voice small. "That's all the water we brought." I didn't have an answer. We hadn't planned for a trip this remote to go wrong. By mid-afternoon, Joe came back, just as he'd promised. I don't think I've ever been happier to see anyone in my life. He looked at us and immediately knew something had happened. "What did you do?" he asked sternly. "We didn't do anything," Kevin said defensively. "This stuff is just happening." Joe shook his head, his face grim. "This land is cursed. I told you. By being here, you've already broken the balance. It feeds off your presence." "Feeds off us?" Linda repeated, her voice trembling. Joe didn't explain further. Instead, he walked over to the RV and took one look at the marked jugs of water. He muttered something under his breath in Navajo, then turned to me. "I can try to protect you," he said quietly, "but you need to leave. Now, tonight, if possible." "The RV won't even start," I told him. "Then we'll try to fix it," he said. But even as he spoke, I could sense that he didn't think it would help. While Joe tried to work on the engine, Kevin wandered off, ignoring my calls for him to stay close. I found him sitting near the canyon wall, staring at something he'd uncovered in the dirt. At first, I thought it was another piece of pottery, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a small talisman made of bone, tied together with strands of what looked like hair. There were faint stains on the bone, dark and dried. "What are you doing with that?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Kevin looked up at me, his eyes distant. "I found it. It's interesting, don't you think? Maybe it's part of some ritual." "Leave it alone," I said firmly. "Why? It's just an artifact." I said, "Leave it." My voice echoed off the canyon walls. Kevin flinched, surprised by my reaction, but he dropped it back into the dirt. I didn't know why I reacted so strongly. It wasn't like me, but something about that talisman, it just felt wrong. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the canyon grew cold, much colder than it should have been for August in Arizona. We huddled around the fire outside the RV, but the flames felt feeble against the chill. Linda kept glancing over her shoulder, and Kevin had stopped cracking jokes, something he usually did when he was nervous. Even Joe, who I thought had seen it all, looked uneasy. "Do you feel that?" Linda whispered after a while. I opened my mouth to ask what she meant, but then I felt it too. It wasn't the temperature or the quiet this time. It was something else. A presence. The fire flickered, and I could have sworn I saw movement in the shadows just beyond the light. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I saw it again. A figure. It was standing perfectly still, just inside the darkness. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either, maybe 20 feet away. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could barely breathe. "Joe," I whispered, "do you see that?" "Yes," he said flatly. "Don't look at it. Don't speak to it." "What is it?" Linda whispered, gripping my arm. "It's watching," Joe said. "They always watch first." The others must have seen it too, because no one moved or said a word after that. We just sat there, staring at the fire, as the figure continued to stand in the shadows, unmoving. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. We retreated into the RV soon after, locking the door behind us. None of us felt safe outside anymore, not with whatever that was. Linda wasn't taking photos, Kevin wasn't making sarcastic remarks, and Joe wasn't warning us anymore. The silence inside the RV was unbearable. Every creak, every gust of wind felt like something far worse. I tried to tell myself that it was all in my head, that we were just tired, stressed, dehydrated, but deep down, I knew better. Something was out there, and it wasn't going to let us leave. I woke up to Linda shaking my shoulder, her voice trembling. David, wake up! Something's wrong!" It was early, barely dawn, and the light creeping through the RV windows was pale and cold. I sat up groggily, but the look on Linda's face snapped me awake. "What is it?" I asked. She rolled up the sleeve of her shirt. Her arm was covered in a red, irritated rash, but it wasn't just random. The marks looked like cymbal patterns that twisted and curved, almost like the ones we'd seen on the pottery and cave walls. I didn't scratch myself or touch anything weird," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "It just appeared." I stared at her arm, my chest tightening. I didn't know what to say. "We need Joe," I finally managed. We found Joe sitting outside the RV, cross-legged on the ground. He had a bundle of herbs in his hand, and he was chanting something in Navajo under his breath. When I showed him Linda's arm, his face hardened. "They've marked her," he said. "Marked her?" I asked, my voice rising. "What does that mean?" "It means she's connected to them now. The skinwalkers." His voice was calm, but his words hit like a punch to the gut. Linda stepped back, panic in her eyes. "Connected? Joe? What are you talking about? How? Why me?" Joe didn't answer her. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small pouch filled with something that smelled like burnt sage. He sprinkled some of it over her arm and started chanting again. "Will this help?" I asked desperately. "It might hide her from them for a while," Joe said, not looking up, "but it won't stop them." The unease in the air thickened as the day went on. The once beautiful canyon now felt like a trap, its walls closing in on us. Kevin tried to distract himself by wandering a few feet from the RV, his camera slung over his shoulder, muttering about how this was all mass hysteria. But then he stopped and called out, Guys, you need to see this." We hurried over, and what we saw made my stomach churn. The small creek we'd found nearby, the one we'd been using to clean up, wasn't water anymore. It was blood. Thick, dark red, and unmistakable. It flowed sluggishly across the rocks, carrying with it an odor that made my head spin. Linda covered her mouth with her hands. "Oh my God," she whispered. Kevin stood frozen, pale as a sheet. This has to be a prank, right? Like someone's screwing with us?" But Joe shook his head. "We're past pranks. The land is warning you now. Leave or..." He didn't finish the sentence, but we all understood anyway. By late afternoon, Kevin started acting off. He was pacing back and forth near the RV, muttering things under his breath. At first, I thought he was just stressed like the rest of us. But then, I listened closer. It wasn't English he was speaking. It wasn't even a language I recognized. "Kevin," I said cautiously, stepping toward him. "You okay?" He stopped pacing and looked at me with a strange expression, like he didn't recognize who I was. "They're watching," he said, his voice flat and distant. "Who's watching?" He pointed toward the canyon walls. "Them. They're everywhere." My heart sank. "Kevin, you need to focus. We'll get through this, but you've got to pull yourself together." He blinked a few times, then shook his head as if snapping out of a trance. "Yeah," he mumbled. "Yeah, sorry. I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. And I knew it. That night, Joe insisted on performing a protection ritual. He said it would keep the skinwalkers at bay for at least one more night. We gathered around the fire as he burned sage and chanted in Navajo, sprinkling sand and intricate patterns on the ground. The chants were low and rhythmic, almost hypnotic. For a while, I thought it might actually work. The air felt lighter, calmer. But then Joe stopped abruptly in the middle of his chant and stared into the darkness beyond the fire. "What is it?" I asked. "They're here," Joe said quietly. We all froze, straining to see what he was looking at. And then we heard Ida low growl, deep and guttural, coming from the shadows. Linda grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "David, what do we do?" Joe stood up slowly, holding what looked like a small ceremonial knife. "Stay inside the circle," he said firmly. "Don't move. Don't speak. Whatever happens, don't leave the circle." We did as he said, huddling together as the growling grew louder. The shadows seemed to shift and twist, like they were alive, and I could feel something watching us, something just beyond the edge of the firelight. And then the fire went out. Panic set in as darkness swallowed us whole. I reached out blindly, grabbing for Linda, for Kevin, for anyone, but all I could hear were their terrified whispers. "Joe!" Kevin shouted. "What's going on?" There was no answer. When the fire finally sparked back to life, it couldn't have been more than a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Joe was gone. "Where is he?" Linda cried, spinning in circles, her voice breaking. I called his name over and over, but there was no response. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. And in the dirt, the intricate patterns he'd made during the ritual were smeared and broken, like something had walked over them. Kevin picked up the ceremonial knife Joe had left behind. His hands were shaking. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I didn't know. For the first time in my life, I had no idea what to do. We were alone now, completely alone. The canyon wasn't just cursed, it was alive. And it wanted us to stay. Forever. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We stayed inside the RV with all the lights on, but even that didn't feel safe. Every little creak, every gust of wind, set my nerves on edge. Linda sat next to me, trembling, her arms pulled tightly around her knees. Kevin was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself again. He was gripping the ceremonial knife Joe had left behind, holding onto it like it was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. "What if Joe's dead?" Linda whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't want to say it out loud, even though I was thinking the same thing. Joe had warned us again and again, and we hadn't listened. Now he was gone, and whatever was out there was still waiting for us. When the sun came up, it brought no relief. The light didn't feel warm or safe. It just made the shadows sharper, the canyon walls taller. Kevin insisted he wanted to explore, to figure out what we were dealing with. I told him it was a bad idea, but he wouldn't listen. Before I could stop him, he grabbed his camera and headed toward the canyon. "Kevin!" I shouted. "Get back here!" But he kept walking, like he couldn't even hear me. "Linda, stay here," I said, grabbing a flashlight and following after him. I found Kevin standing near the canyon wall, staring at something scratched into the rock. His breathing was heavy, and his eyes looked wide and glassy. "Kevin," I said, stepping closer, "what are you doing?" He pointed to the wall without saying anything. I followed his gaze and saw it markings, new ones, carved jaggedly into the rock. They weren't there yesterday. "What is this?" I whispered. Kevin's voice was low and almost robotic. "They want us to understand, but we're not listening." "What are you talking about?" I asked, grabbing his arm. "Kevin, snap out of it." He turned to me slowly, and for a moment, I didn't recognize him. His face looked wrong, like his features had shifted just slightly. His eyes were darker, his skin pale. "They're coming," he said. Then he smiled a slow, eerie grin that made my blood run cold. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "Kevin, stop." And just like that, he blinked and shook his head. "What?" he asked, his voice back to normal. "What's wrong?" You didn't," I stuttered, but I couldn't even explain what I'd just seen. He frowned at me like I was the one acting strange. "Whatever, man. Let's just go back. When we got back to the RV, something was different. The air inside felt heavier, thicker, like it was hard to breathe. Linda was sitting at the table, staring at her camera. "They're in these," she said quietly, sliding the camera toward me. "What do you mean?" I asked. She handed me the photos she'd taken. At first, they looked normal shots of the canyon, the pottery, me and Kevin standing near the cave paintings. But then I noticed something in the background of each picture. Figures. Small at first, like shadows barely visible in the distance. But in each photo, they were closer. By the last picture, one of them was standing right behind me. I dropped the photos, my heart racing. "There's more," Linda whispered. She pulled out her camera and showed me the last picture she'd taken that morning. It wasn't us, but it was inside the RV. The photo showed the table, the beds, even the curtains. And sitting on one of the bunks was a figure. It was human-shaped but twisted, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. "That's impossible," I said, my voice shaking. Linda looked up at me, tears in her eyes. "I didn't take that picture." By the time the sun started to set, we were all on edge. Kevin had turned quiet again, sitting in the corner of the RV with the knife in his lap. Linda wouldn't stop looking out the window, her body tense like she was expecting something to burst through the door at any moment. I tried to figure out a plan, but my mind was blank. The RV still wouldn't start. We had no water, and we were miles from help. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared over the horizon, the canyon grew deathly still. And then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the RV. Linda grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "David, it's them," she whispered. Kevin stood up, gripping the knife tightly. "They're not getting in," he said, his voice low and determined. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was silence, and I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd left. But then the scratching started. It came from the walls of the RV long, scraping claws dragging across the metal. The sound made my teeth ache, and Linda covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Stay calm," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince myself or them. Kevin moved toward the door, his posture rigid. "If they want us, they're going to have to fight me first," he said. "Kevin, don't!" I hissed, grabbing his arm. Before I could stop him, he flung the door open. At first, the light from Kevin's flashlight caught nothing but empty desert. The scratching stopped, and the silence returned. He stepped outside cautiously, the knife in one hand, the flashlight in the other. "See?" he said, turning back to us with a shaky grin. "Nothing here, it's all in R." Before he could finish, his flashlight flickered, and I saw a figure standing just a few feet behind him. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was tall, too tall, with disjointed limbs and glowing eyes that pinned us in place. "Kevin!" I shouted. He spun around, but by the time he did, the figure was gone. "They're playing with us," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was right. Whatever these things were, they weren't just attacking us. They were toying with us, waiting for the right moment to strike. And deep down, I knew we wouldn't survive the night. Kevin stood frozen in the open doorway, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "I saw it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It was right there, right behind me." "Get back inside," I shouted, my voice sharper than I intended. Kevin snapped out of his trance and stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door shut. His breathing was shallow, and sweat dripped down his face. He dropped the knife onto the table and ran his hand through his hair. "They're not just outside," Linda said quietly. She was staring at the window, her hands trembling. "They're everywhere." Her words sent a chill through me. I didn't want to believe it, but she was right. These things weren't just circling the RV. They were inside our minds, messing with what we could see and hear. The air inside the RV felt heavier by the second, like it was pressing down on us. And then it started to happen, the walls, The very walls of the RV began to bleed. At first, it was just small streaks of red oozing from the seams. Linda noticed it first, pointing silently at the corner above her head. The sticky liquid trickled down in thin, shiny lines before pooling on the floor. Kevin backed away from the wall, his eyes wide, his hand on the knife again. "What the hell is this?" he shouted. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. The lights flickered overhead, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath. I reached out to touch the walls, hoping to wipe the red streaks away, but the moment my fingers brushed the surface, the entire RV seemed to groan like it was alive. "It's the canyon," Linda said suddenly. Her voice was calm, too calm, which made it even scarier. "It knows we're here. It doesn't want us to leave." Linda grabbed her camera again, her movements frantic. She started snapping pictures of the RV, the walls, even Kevin and me. I didn't stop her. I think part of me hoped the camera might capture something we couldn't see. It wasn't until she flipped through the photos that we realized how much worse things were getting. These aren't right," she said, tears welling in her eyes as she showed us the pictures. The first ones showed exactly what was in front of us: the bleeding walls, Kevin clutching the knife, me standing still like a statue. But as we went through them, the images twisted. The walls weren't just bleeding anymore, they were pulsating, like they had veins. The floor was covered in shadows that didn't match anything in the room. And in the last photo, there was something standing right behind me. I froze, staring at the screen. The entity in the photo wasn't fully formed, was blurry, its edges smoky and undefined, but its glowing eyes burned right through the image. I felt my stomach twist. How did you take that?" "I didn't," Linda whispered. Kevin backed away from the table, his voice trembling. "We have to get out of here. I don't care if the RV won't start, we can walk out." "Number." Linda grabbed his arm. "We're miles from the main road. If they can find us here, they can find us out there." The scratching started again, louder this time. It wasn't just outside, it was coming from all directions, inside and outside the RV. And then we heard it. A voice. It started low, barely audible, like someone whispering directly into our ears. My name, Linda's name, Kevin's name, over and over again. "Do you hear that?" Kevin asked, his eyes darting around the room. "We all hear it," I said. My voice was shaking just as much as his was. And then the voice grew louder. It wasn't just one voice anymore, it was dozens, all blending together in a horrible echoing chant. The sound filled the RV, and for a moment, I thought my head would split open. "Stop it!" Linda screamed, covering her ears. And just like that, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. And then, through the window, I saw it. It was standing in the canyon, just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams. At first, it looked like a deer, but as it stepped closer, it shifted a tall, humanoid figure with long, bony arms and glowing eyes. Its face wasn't a face at all. It was the skull of a deer, just like the one in Linda's photo. And it was coming closer. Kevin stood, gripping the knife so tightly his knuckles went white. "We can fight it," he said. "We have to fight it." "Kevin, no!" I yelled, but he didn't listen. He threw open the door, stepping out into the night. The thing tilted its head, its glowing eyes locking onto Kevin. For a moment, it didn't move, but then it started to shift. Its body twisted and stretched, its arms lengthening until they nearly touched the ground. Its legs bent backward like an animal's, then snapped forward again. Kevin screamed and stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door shut behind him. "It's in my head," he shouted, clutching his head with both hands. "It's inside my head." He collapsed onto the floor, shaking violently. Linda rushed to him, trying to help, but his body was cold and stiff. His skin looked pale, almost gray, and his eyes rolled back in his head. I knelt beside him, terrified. "Kevin, look at me." But he didn't answer. He just kept shaking, his mouth moving like he was whispering something. And then, slowly, he looked up at me. His eyes weren't his anymore, they were glowing, just like the thing outside. "It's too late," he whispered. "We're already theirs." This wasn't just a curse. It wasn't just a legend. Whatever we'd disturbed wasn't going to let us go. And for the first time, I realized we might not survive the next dawn. Joe's voice echoed through the canyon, strong and commanding. I didn't understand all the words he was chanting, but whatever he was doing, it was working. The skinwalkers hesitated, their flickering forms pulling back toward the shadows. "David!" Joe yelled again. "The circle! You have to finish it!" I looked at the burial site, the stones, the spear I was still gripping tightly, and realized what he meant. The stones had been moved, disturbed over time. The circle was broken. "Linda, take the knife," I said, tossing her Joe's ceremonial blade. "Protect yourself." "What are you going to do?" she asked, panic in her voice. "I'm fixing this," I shouted, already moving. I dropped to my knees and started dragging the scattered stones back into place, one by one. My hands shook as I worked, and my mind screamed at me to move faster, to finish before the skinwalkers decided to attack again. Joe's chants grew louder, more urgent. He stood firm, his presence keeping the monsters at bay, but I could see the strain in his face. Linda kept her back to me, holding the knife with trembling hands. "Hurry, David," she pleaded. The stones were heavy, rough, and cold to the touch. My fingers felt raw as I placed the last one into the circle. "It's done!" I yelled. Joe nodded and raised his arms, his chanting hitting a crescendo. The wind around us roared to life, swirling inside the circle like a storm. The ground beneath me vibrated, and I felt a deep hum, like the earth itself was awakening. The wind died suddenly, and for a brief moment, everything was still. Then I saw it, him. The leader of the skinwalkers stepped forward, emerging fully into the light. It was the same one I'd seen before, the one from Linda's photo. 12 feet tall, with bony limbs too long for its body, and a deer skull for its head. Its eyes glowed a deep, unnatural red. "You dare?" it hissed, the voice clawing at my mind like nails on a chalkboard. The others stayed close to the shadows, but this one moved with purpose, stepping into the circle without hesitation. Joe's chants faltered, his face twisting in pain as the creature advanced on him. "Joe!" I shouted, gripping the spear tightly. The creature turned its attention to me. "You cannot undo what has been done," it said, its voice a sickening blend of human and animal tones. "Go back!" I yelled, holding the spear out in front of me. My hands were shaking, but I refused to lower it. "This land isn't yours anymore." The creature laughed, a horrible rasping sound. "This land has always been ours." The skinwalker lunged at me, faster than anything I'd ever seen. I barely had time to react, thrusting the spear forward. It struck the creature in the chest, but it didn't collapse like the others. Instead, it grabbed the spear with its long, clawed hands, yanking it away from me. I stumbled back, falling to the ground. It towered over me, raising one hand, its claws gleaming like blades. "David!" Linda screamed. Before I could stop her, she ran forward, slamming the ceremonial knife into the creature's side. It let out a deafening screech, turning to face her. "Linda, no!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. But it was too late. The creature backhanded her with enough force to send her flying several feet, her body hitting the ground hard. "Linda!" I ran to her side, my hands shaking as I cradled her head. She looked up at me, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Finish it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have to end this." I didn't want to leave her, but I knew she was right. I turned back to the circle. The skinwalker was still there, its form flickering as it tried to pull the knife from its side. Joe was kneeling now, his chanting weak but steady, holding the others at bay. I grabbed the spear and stepped into the center of the circle. The hum in the air grew louder, the vibration almost unbearable. "Seal it, David!" Joe yelled, his voice strained. "Break the connection!" I didn't know exactly what to do, but something inside my instinct, Mabel told me to drive the spear into the ground. I raised it high and slammed it down with all my strength. The moment the spear struck the earth, a shockwave rippled through the canyon. The ground shook violently, and the skinwalkers let out a collective scream, their forms disintegrating into shadows that were sucked into the burial ground. The leader's glowing eyes locked onto mine one last time before its body was pulled into the earth, disappearing with a final, guttural growl. And then, everything fell silent. I sank to my knees, my chest heaving as the weight of what had just happened washed over me. The canyon felt still again, the oppressive energy gone. Joe stumbled toward me, his face pale and exhausted. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice low. "It's done. The seal is restored." I turned to Linda, who was still lying on the ground. I crawled to her side, my hands shaking as I lifted her head. "Linda," I whispered. "It's over. We did it." She smiled weakly, her eyes glistening with tears. "David, take care of them." "Take care of who?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. But before she could answer, her body went limp in my arms. Joe and I left the canyon together, walking for hours until we found help. The RV was still there, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it. It felt like a marker of everything we'd been through. When we reached safety, no one believed our story. They said Linda's death was an accident, that Kevin must have wandered off and gotten lost. But I knew the truth. The canyon was alive, and it had taken them both. Now, every time I close my eyes, I see them, the shadows moving in the corner of my vision, the glowing eyes watching from the darkness. The land may be sealed, but the curse never really goes away.